Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's talk, co-organized by the Philip K. Zhong Center for Chinese Law in the Faculty of Law, the Department of History, the Department of Comparative Literature, and the Center for the Study of Globalization and the Cultures in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Hong Kong. I'm Xiaowei Lin, and will be chairing today's event. Today, we are very honored to have our distinguished speaker, Professor Matthew Sommer, deliver a talk entitled The Prosecution of Transgender as Heterodoxy in Qing Dynasty China. As many of you might have already known, Professor Sommer is a renowned social and legal historian of Qing Dynasty China. He is a Baumann Family Professor of History at Stanford University, and his research uses original legal case records from central and local levels to explore gender, sexuality, and family. His first book, Sex, Law, and Society in Late Imperial China, was published by Stanford University Press in 2000. The simplified Chinese translation of this book, 中华帝国晚期的性、法律与社会, was published by Guangxi Normal University Press in 2023, and has sold more than 40,000 copies and is now in its 7th reprint. It also ranked by the Chinese Cultural Social Media, 豆瓣, as one of the year's best books in history and culture. It has received more than 2,300 reviews from Chinese readers on Douban platform, achieving an impressive average rating of 9.1 out of 10 scores. Professor Sommer's second book, Polyandry and Wife Selling in Qing Dynasty China, was published by the University of California Press in 2015. Which was the inaugural winner of the Peter Gumwelstein Book Award of the American Society for Legal History, which annually awards for the best book in non-US legal history. Today, Professor Sommer will share his latest and also the third book, The Fox Spirit, Stone Maiden, and the Other Transgender Histories from Late Imperial China, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2024. This book has won the Oswell Prize from the LGBTQ+ History Association, which recognized an outstanding book on LGBTQ history published in English every 2 years. And today we are also very honored to have our discussant, Professor Yang Bingbing. Professor Yang is an associate professor at the School of Chinese, University of Hong Kong. Her research focuses on women's literary and cultural protections in late Imperial China, and draws from the newly accessible sources in the area to address broader issues in social and cultural histories in China, and also in dialogues with studies of women and gender in cross-cultural context. Professor Yang's monographs include Heroines of the Qing, Exemplary Women Tell Their Stories in 2016, and Women Writers of Huizhou, Imaginaries of Space and Place in Qing China in 2025, along with many other journal articles. Her future research will investigate gender and the boundaries of knowledge in early modern and modern China. I believe today's event will be an inspiring interdisciplinary dialogue among law, history, literature, and gender studies. Professor Sommer will first deliver the talk for around 60 minutes, and Professor Yang will make comments to deepen the discussions and facilitate the conversations for around 15 minutes. And then we will open the floor for Q&A from the audience. And now let's welcome Professor Sommer to give this amazing talk.
A real pleasure to return to HKU after many years. The last time I was here, I participated in a conference on masculinity in China, and that was organized by Professor Cam Louis and Louise Edwards, who I think are both, Cam is retired and Professor Edwards is now in Australia. That was 10 years ago. And I had the great pleasure at that time of having Professor Yang Bingbing be the discussant on my paper. And so it's a real treat to come back, and I'm having a sense of very nice deja vu to have, again, the honor of having Professor Yang be my discussant again. So I would like to thank the Faculty of Law for hosting me, especially Dean Professor Fu Hualing, and also Professor Xiaowei Lin, who made the arrangements, and also Louisa Chu, who handled the logistics so beautifully. Thank you to all. It's nice also to see so many old friends here, and nice to have a chance to make new friends. So as Professor Xiao said, I'll be talking a bit about my new book. Specifically, I'll be I'll be presenting two cases. Two of the cases I talk about in the book. These are both from the Qing Dynasty, China's last imperial dynasty. These were both individuals assigned male at birth who lived as women while carefully concealing their assigned sex to others. One presented themselves as a widow and then had a successful career as a midwife for 30 years. The other channeled a female fox spirit to heal women's illnesses and also served as wife to a male partner. Both of these people were eventually exposed and prosecuted for the crime of a male masquerading in female attire, 男扮女装. So what were the circumstances of these people's lives? How did Qing Dynasty officials interpret their violation of normative gender boundaries? And specifically, why did the Qing judiciary prosecute 男扮女装, a male masquerading in female attire, as a form of heterodoxy, as a kind of 左道? These are the questions I'll be talking about today. Since this is a legal audience primarily, I'll be emphasizing the legal history aspect a bit more than I might otherwise. Is the sound okay? It's not too loud? It's okay? It's all right? Good. Okay. So first of all, let me explain what I mean by transgender in this context. And it's a challenge to know exactly how to use this term as an historian, as opposed to thinking about identity categories and labels that are familiar today. So I've been following historian Susan Stryker, who defines transgender people as those who move away from the gender they were assigned at birth, and thereby cross over or trans the boundaries constructed by their culture to define and contain their gender. Susan Stryker is deliberately agnostic about the motivation for such movement and also the meanings assigned to that movement in context. She avoids specifying the endpoint of that movement or whether it is permanent or temporary. Moreover, Stryker focuses on practice rather than identity. In other words, what did people do and what did that mean in historical context? This is a way to avoid anachronism and to illuminate parallels and differences between a variety of historical and cultural contexts. Stryker's approach laid a firm conceptual foundation for the very new field of transgender history. And this has informed the work of other historians, such as Jen Mannion, and also Claire Sears and others. And also this basically laid the conceptual framework for this book of mine. So the focus is practice rather than identity. If we think about it, in transgender politics today, a core value is self-determination. In other words, my gender identity is for me to decide. It's not for some doctor or the government to tell me. It's not for my parents to tell me what it is. Rather, it's for me to decide and determine myself. If we take that seriously as a value, then it seems presumptuous and wrong to start putting labels on people who lived 200 years ago, who did not have the same vocabulary or conceptual apparatus that is familiar now. I think it is better to avoid the risk of anachronism by trying to categorize everyone and guess how they would identify if they were alive today, and instead to focus on what people did and what that meant in historical context. Right, so that's the approach that I'm taking, again, inspired by Susan Stryker. So, for example, I will use trans as a verb to transgender. This is following Jen Mannion, who's another historian inspired by this line of inquiry. So that's basically what I mean by transgender. Now, broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, most historical societies have addressed people who transgender in one of two ways. And both of these ways appear in China. I'll be talking about both of them today. The first is demonization. And this demonization is what informs ideology and law. Basically, we're talking about the paranoid fantasy of the cross-dresser as a predator, a dangerous predator practicing a kind of fraud for some evil purpose. This, I think, will probably be familiar to people today. You find this in the Qing Dynasty, you find it in the United States today. I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. So you have demonization with the ideology and law. The second way that historical societies have addressed people who are transgender is sacralization. And this informs what we might call popular religious culture in a number of places. Basically, the idea here is that gender variant people have been touched by the divine, and therefore they are qualified to serve as ritual specialists or healers of one kind or another. And again, we find this in China, I will argue, We also find it in South Asia with the Hijras. We find it with gender transing spirit mediums in Vietnam. We find it in a number of Native American cultures, the so-called two-spirit people. This is a modern term, but it refers to such individuals who serve as shamans, healers, and so on. So in many cultures around the world, you can find analogs to this, right? Where the gender variant individual has been touched by the divine and therefore is especially qualified to play some ritual role for their communities, often as a healer. So we see both of these in China. And again, more background. I think it might be useful to stop and reflect for a moment what people looked like in the Qing Dynasty, and especially what were the visual gender cues. So if you saw someone walking down the street in the 18th century or the 19th century, how did you know they were a man or a woman? Very basic question. Well, so, I mean, this may be obvious to all of you, but on the left, we have 3 young men. On the right, we have 3 young women. With the men, most obvious gender cue is the way the hair was tonsured. As probably you know, when the Manchus conquered China in the 17th century, they imposed on Han Chinese men a specific hairstyle, the Manchu hairstyle, in which the front of the head is shaved and the hair on the back is grown out long and braided into a single cue, bins. Okay? So you see this on the left. That was the most obvious cue that someone was a man. On the right, you have 3 young women. Their hair obviously is done differently. Their bodies are relatively more covered, but also they have bound feet. Now, not all women bound their feet in the Qing Dynasty, but a lot of them did, including many peasants and ordinary women. The incidence of foot binding among ordinary people varied from place to place according to the local economy. But basically, these are the most obvious gender cues. Also, women would have their ears pierced. So if you saw a person with their hair long and not shaved here, then ears pierced and feet bound, it's like, okay, that's a woman. If you saw an individual who did not have bound feet and had the front of the head shaved and a genza, that's a man. So these are the most obvious gender cues. And my guess is that these were so powerful that they may have overridden any other visual evidence about gender that one might have taken in. So having said that, let's talk about the first case. So this is the case of Xiongmumu, the widow who became a midwife. The case begins in 1723 when a woman aged 40 arrived at a village in Anfu County in Hunan looking for work. And she arrived there alone. She introduced herself as Xiongmumu. Mumu translates roughly as elder sister-in-law. And she explained that her husband had died and her evil in-laws were trying to force her to remarry. And so to preserve her chastity in honor of her dead husband, she had run away, she had shaved her head, and become a Buddhist nun. Now, more recently, she had decided to leave the temple and to Huansu, where it was returned to lay life. So that involved growing her hair back out at uniform length. Now, this question of the hair is, I think, significant. We'll come back to that in a moment. So she claimed to be a skilled midwife and a healer of women's illnesses. And when put to the test, this claim proved to be true. She settled down and became a popular figure in the community because she was friendly, she had a good sense of humor, and there was much demand for her skills. Midwifery is one of the few ways that a single woman in that era might have made a living, and Xiongmumu was very successful. He provided midwifery skills, services in this village, nearby villages, and so on. After 3 years, Xiongmumu had saved enough money to adopt a young landless peasant man as her son to carry on her dead husband's family line. And then she also arranged for this adopted son to take a wife. And then her adopted son and daughter-in-law also adopted a son and then acquired a wife for him as well. In addition, Xiongmumu pledged ganxin, kinship, with 3 young women in their village, taking them as her ganyuar. These are the equivalent of a kind of goddaughter. Probably you all know about ganxin, kinship. But so in this way, Xiongmumu created a kinship network of 8 people, a kind of surrogate family. Now, the foundation of this household was land. By the time of her arrest, she had amassed 32 mu of rice paddy land, and she was living in a 6-room house. And apparently all of that was paid for with her earnings as a midwife, because as far as we know, she arrived in this village with nothing but her clothes, more or less. By communist era standards, that much land would have qualified Xiongmumu as a fun, a rich peasant, possibly a small landlord. Xiongmumu had also sent money back to her natal family to pay for the marriage of her younger brother, who was her only sibling. So somehow she had managed to keep in touch with her natal family back in her home county, which was about 50 miles away. But after living in the community peacefully for more than 20 years, Xiongmumu became involved in a lawsuit with her brother. By this time, she had reached the age of 60 sui, and somehow she stayed in touch with her natal family. Her parents had died, and her brother had taken over her parents' land and refused to share this land with his sister. This made Xiongmumu angry, and so she filed a lawsuit at the county yamen because, as she stated in her plaint, her gaozhuang, she believed that she deserved a half share of their father's estate. She wanted 50% of the father's estate. Now, if you know anything about inheritance practices, the practice of fenjia in traditional China, you know this is kind of an absurd claim because everybody knew that in both law and custom, brothers would divide their father's estate in equal shares. The rule was 诸子均分, right? So brothers or sons divide in equal shares, whereas sisters received nothing at fenjia. In a very well-to-do family, something might be set aside for a sister's dowry to take with her when she got married, but nothing would be received through fenjia and direct inheritance. So all became clear, however, when Xiongmumu's brother filed a counterclaim, a suzhuang, in which he explained that in fact his sister was actually a man and had been masquerading as a woman for more than 30 years. So Xiongmumu was arrested, and then the magistrate ordered a midwife to examine Xiongmumu, a strip search. The midwife reported that Xiongmumu had what the midwife deemed to be normal male anatomy. In other words, there was no evidence of disease or a genital anomaly of any kind, and therefore this was in fact a man, according to the midwife. Now, confronted with this evidence, Xiongmumu confessed that it was true. Their real name was Xiong Ersheng. They had never married, and at the age of 26, they had left home, grown out their hair, pierced their ears, bound their feet, loosely we assume, and adopted women's dress. They provided no explanation for the decision to live as a woman, nor did they explain how they acquired training as a midwife, which is a really interesting question because that's not a trivial skill set. Right? We know this story because the provincial governor reported it to the emperor in Beijing, the Qianlong emperor, in a secret memorial, a Zhupi Zouzhe, that remains on file at the palace archives in Beijing. In this memorial, the governor expressed outrage at the local magistrate's lenience. He confided to the emperor, quote, "The criminal Xiong Ersheng, despite being male, has masqueraded in women's attire, 男扮女装, for more than 30 years, adopting 干女儿 and using the alias Xiongmumu. On that basis, we can be sure without even bothering to ask that he must have seduced and raped women on a routine basis. 平日奸污之事，不问可知." Again, 不问可知 is an interesting phrase. We can be sure without even bothering to ask. Someone who destroys family relations and injures the public morality in such an egregious manner cannot be tolerated in your majesty's sacred realm. Xiong Ersheng's crimes must have taken place in the obscurity of the female chambers, and an exhaustive investigation would involve countless people and endless trouble. Moreover, it is inevitable that some of the women involved, upon hearing of this, would commit suicide out of shame. The scale of harm is truly great. So that is all from the governor's memorial to the emperor. So the governor promised to hold Xiongmumu under tight security, to scour the village for their accomplices, while interrogating Xiong closely to ascertain what other acts of sorcery, black magic, debauchery they had committed. Now, this record of this case raises more questions than we can answer with any certainty. First of all, what motivated Xiong to live as a woman? They did so at great risk, as the consequences of exposure make clear. The emperor ordered that Xiong be, first of all, forced to tonsure their hair in the proper manner of a man, and to wear a man's clothes and stop piercing the ears. And then Xiong was turned over to the board of war to be transferred to Heilongjiang in the far north of Manchuria to serve as a slave in the army for the rest of their life. That was considered a lenient sentence because the alternative would have been death. And so the emperor here was being merciful. And we can only imagine how long Xiong must have lived in such dire circumstances. So they did this at a great risk. Now, it's very possible, of course, that if Xiong were alive today, they would identify as a trans woman. That's certainly possible, but we cannot be sure. And so that's speculation. The identity of trans woman was not available in 18th century China, at least not in anything remotely like what this means for us today. Be that as it may, Xiong obviously felt powerful motivation to live as a woman and was able to live in that identity as a woman without any trouble, as far as we can tell, for more than 30 years. This also, I think, is significant. It's also significant that nobody in the community complained about it. Right? They only got caught because they filed this crazy lawsuit against their brother, claiming a 50% share, which is sort of like trying to have your cake and eat it too. It's almost as though Xiong wanted to live as a woman, but retain the privileges of a man, the inheritance rights of a man while living a life as a woman. Can't have it both ways, apparently. But the authorities who interrogated Xiong all treated this as a case of a man pretending to be a woman for what they assumed to be evil purposes. From what we can tell, the authorities never asked Xiong about their motive for wanting to live as a woman, about their subjective consciousness at all. Rather, the governor's rhetoric makes it clear that he already knew the only plausible motive for such behavior, to seduce or rape women. In the governor's own words, we can be sure without even bothering to ask, that Xiong had committed these crimes. This, despite the fact that, as far as we can tell from the case record, there was no evidence that Xiong had ever harmed anyone. There was no evidence that Xiong even ever had sex with anyone, let alone raped or seduced anyone. In fact, there were no complaints against them at all. On the contrary, they were a popular and valued member of their community. So another intriguing question is where Xiong learned to be a midwife. And this is a real mystery because midwifery was an exclusively women's occupation. It was typically learned by apprenticeship, with a young girl learning by helping an older, experienced woman, such as maybe her mother or grandmother. Could Xiong have done this perhaps in their 20s after they had started to present as a woman? We don't know. It remains a mystery, but it's an intriguing mystery. And I often feel like this case cries out for being written up as a novel or as a movie because there are so many gaps that could only be filled in through the imagination. The third question, which is perhaps the most important for us today, is where did the governor's knowledge, quote, come from, this knowledge that Xiong must be a sex predator, right? So before we get into that, let's talk a bit about what paradigms existed for gender crossing, gender transing in China during the Ming-Qing period. Now, of course, the best known paradigm for female to male crossing is the legendary woman warrior Hua Mulan. I'm sure all of you have heard of Hua Mulan. According to this paradigm, a virtuous young woman acts out of filial duty to take her father's place or her brother's place in the military draft. She passes as a man temporarily in order to do her duty as a soldier, always carefully guarding her chastity, staying within the bounds of propriety. And when her duty is fulfilled, she resumes female attire and returns home to her duty as a daughter. In other words, Mulan is an exception that proves the rule. Her gender passing is justified only by her selfless devotion to Confucian propriety. She dresses as a man in order to serve the patriarchy, not to subvert the patriarchy. This positive paradigm illustrates by implication the dangers of violating the proper separation of the sexes, the danger that a woman might attempt to pass as a man in order to escape supervision and perhaps to engage in sexual promiscuity. Now, and here we have Mulan. These are modern paintings. Here, Mulan returning to her role as a girl. In the modern era, Mulan has inspired feminists and revolutionaries who have adopted masculine attire in order to declare their selfless commitment to performing a public role in a political cause. One of the most famous examples and earliest is Qiujin, of course, the revolutionary martyr put to death by the Qing Dynasty in 1907 when she was in her 30s. And these are famous photos, but she seems to have engaged in kind of cosplay in which she would dress up in a certain way and have a photo taken as a way of experimenting with what a modern politically committed woman looks like. You know, once you leave behind the separation of the sexes and the Confucian old family, how far do you go in in challenging that. So you have her dressed as a Western man, on the right dressed as a modern Chinese man, in the middle dressed as a modern Japanese woman, holding a knife. And these are famous pictures, but she seems to have experimented with this to declare her rejection of the traditional Confucian roles of women. And Qiujin then inspired many revolutionaries and feminists later on. And of course, in the Mao period, we have the Iron Girls and Red Guards, who are famous examples of this. Now, if we think of other paradigms for transing gender or gender crossing, I would argue that chujia, or leaving the family, really should be considered in this category as well. I believe that the notion of leaving the family, chujia, to become Buddhist clergy, Taoist ascetics, or eunuchs, taijian, fits Susan Stryker's definition of transing gender very well. If we look at Buddhist clergy, Taoist ascetics, and eunuchs, all of them moved away from their natal families. All of them abandoned normative gender roles that were defined in terms of marriage and reproduction within the family. In that sense, they fit Stryker's definition well. So in the case of Buddhist clergy, for example, and here we have some images, they would shave their heads, and male clergy and Taoist ascetics, these were the only men in China who were permitted not to wear the Manchu tonsure, which again suggests that they were seen as somehow a category outside normative masculinity. So they would shave their heads in this sort of gender-neutral head shaving. They also wore baggy gender-neutral clothing. They were given new names, typically the surname of Shi from Shi Jiamuni, plus a two-character name that would come from some Buddhist sutra. And then they would move into single-sex communities outside the family, where a kind of a lineage of master-disciple, mentor-mentee would replace the lineage of the patriarchal family. And of course, they were supposed to abstain from sex, reproduction, and marriage. Today in Taiwan, when women become nuns, they receive what amounts to a kind of defeminization training to eliminate feminine mannerisms in speech and body language. And if asked, they consider themselves not to be women, but rather zhongxing, to be gender neutral. They have transcended gender differences. So you have this basic ideology of Buddhism transcending binaries, including that of sex and gender, which translates into this kind of abandonment of traditional gender rules. So I see chujia in this context as a kind of gender transing practice. Now, in the case of eunuchs, some of what I said about clergy is also true. Eunuchs were castrated, of course, but they were also required to renounce marriage and adoption. They also left behind their families and family-based gender rules to join the imperial household as what amounted to slaves of the imperial household. Upon entering service, they experienced a kind of rebirth and were given new names as part of a quasi-kinship network of mentors and mentees within the eunuch establishment, in effect being adopted by senior eunuchs. Eunuchs who were rejected for imperial service typically became Buddhist monks, as would eunuchs who retired. Some of them became Taoist clergy as well. So the eunuchs actually overlapped with the clergy, kind of an interesting detail. Now, it must be said, for both clergy and eunuchs, there was a degree of ambiguity. In some respects, they were certainly understood to be men, or in the case of nuns, women. Some of this ambiguity implies a distinction between a sexed body and a gendered social role. And for clergy in particular, it was in terms of the gendered social role that they left the family, because they retained their sexed bodies, unlike eunuchs. Now, the available paradigms for male to female passing were far less positive. The most famous, of course, is the young male actors who played the female roles in opera, the ban. And we have here Professor Wu Cunsun, who is the expert on this topic. In 18th and 19th century Beijing, these actors were the objects of a passionate connoisseur culture among elite men. Many actors moonlighted as high-end escorts and prostitutes to serve the wealthy men who admired them. As Professor Wu has shown, by the mid-19th century, some opera troupes were making more money from sex trade than from opera. And what happened on stage was advertising for the charms of the actors that were being rented out off stage. Elite connoisseurs believed that these youthful actors were able to perform an ideal feminine beauty far better and more effectively than a mere woman could. And I think it shows that the allure of this kind of beauty was artifice. It was a kind of gender performance rather than what was natural. It shows that its foundation was misogyny, really a kind of contempt for real women. The notion that this performance of femininity was far superior to anything that a real woman could do, a cis woman. Now, sex between males was prohibited by the Qing Dynasty as the crime of jijian, but it was never as high a priority for prosecution as female promiscuity. The true obsession of the Qing Dynasty's judiciary with regard to sex was to protect female chastity. In other words, the chastity of wives and daughters of good family, 良家妇女, 良家妻女. Now, this focus on female chastity leads us to the second paradigm for male to female passing, the one that is most relevant to us today. This is the renyao, or the hypersexual shape-shifting monster who preyed upon chastely cloistered women. The locus classicus for this paradigm is in the Ming-Qing era was the infamous case of sanctioned from the 15th century. According to the Ming Shilu, the veritable records of the Ming Dynasty, a man named Chong from Taiyuan Prefecture in Shanxi was executed by slicing, 凌迟, in 1477 on the orders of the emperor. As a youth, Chong had apprenticed himself to a master sorcerer. Here we have the Chinese text if you want it. This master sorcerer taught him to perform women's work, such as embroidery, and to masquerade as a woman in order to seek employment in the female quarters of proper households. Having insinuated himself among the women, Chong's master would proceed to seduce them. And if they resisted, he would use black magic to subdue and rape them. So Chong learned these black skills from this master sorcerer. And then Chong later recruited 7 disciples of his own to carry out these debauches over this very wide geographical area. By the time he was arrested, Chong had supposedly seduced or raped more than 180 women in more than 4 counties across northern China. He was finally exposed when a man tried to rape him, ironically enough, exposed his fraud and turned him into the authorities. His accomplices seemed to have escaped. Now, I think this story is really incredible, but the fact that it appears in the Ming Shilu means that at least the court chroniclers who compiled the Ming Shilu believed it to be true. This is a nonfiction text, right? The Ming Shilu for a given emperor's reign would be compiled in the early years of the next emperor's reign. So this text dates from about maybe 10 years after the case actually happened. And so therefore, I think we can accept that this at least was believed to happen, and someone named Chong was actually put to death in this way for these supposed crimes. Now, I'm speculating, I think it's likely that this is an individual who was found to be 男扮女装, masquerading in female attire, and then was tortured into confessing these things in order to fulfill a script that already existed in the minds of the interrogators. Again, getting back to the governor's statement, without even bothering to ask, no, the one could, right? So I think that's probably what happened. And yet this is a nonfiction source, at least ostensibly. So this case was widely reported and elaborated. And over the next 3 centuries, it inspired many fictional accounts in the zhiguai genre, some by famous authors like Li Yu, Song Ning Yuan, Ling Wunshu, and others. In some accounts, Chong and his disciples were literal shapeshifters. They could actually switch their anatomy back and forth from male to female as necessary. So they would have a pop-out penis so they could produce or retract as appropriate. They did this to facilitate their masquerade. Some of them used knockout drugs, to facilitate their rape. They also used black magic. But in all of these accounts, the renyao is a hyper-masculine sexual predator who pretends to be a woman for the sole purpose of getting access to chaste women in the inner female quarters of good households in order to have sex with them. So when Qing Dynasty jurists, encountered cases of what they called a male masquerading in female attire, 男扮女装, their investigations were informed by this paradigm. Even when the individuals under interrogation admitted to having enjoyed sex with men, the magistrates were not interested in that. This was a needless distraction. Instead, they would demand to know, often using torture, how many women did you seduce? How many women did you rape? This was their obsession, because they already knew, based on this paradigm, that that's what 男扮女装 was really about. So according to this paradigm, male to female transing had nothing to do with gender inversion, gender dysphoria, homosexuality, or even femininity. Qing officials had nothing in their conceptual apparatus that was usefully similar to the concept of transgender as we understand it today. Instead, they believed male to female transing was a vehicle for male sexual aggression against women. Now, excuse me. As I'm sure you've noticed, it's intriguing how closely this paradigm of the sexual predator resembles the paranoid fantasies that inform transphobia today in the United States and other places. Modern transphobia is especially hostile towards trans women. And a classic example is the portrayal of trans women in popular Hollywood movies like Psycho, Dressed to Kill, Silence of the Lambs, where they appear to be insane serial killers. A more recent example from American politics is the effort to ban trans people from public restrooms that match their gender identity because of the supposed danger that deranged male sex predators in drag would pose to the safety of women and girls. What these manifestations of modern transphobia share with the sanctioned paradigm is the paranoid fantasy of the trans woman as a dangerous fraud who poses a threat to, quote, real women. This is the common thread. And it's interesting, as different as Ming-Qing China and 21st century United States are, and they're very different, it must be admitted, they did have some things in common. I find that intriguing. We can talk about that more later if you like. Incidentally, this paradigm of the cross-dressing sexual predator had a parallel in the way clergy and eunuchs were perceived as well. So if you've read any Ming-Qing novels, you know that clergy were stereotyped in popular culture as wolves in sheep clothing, who only pretended to be celibate and to transcend gender in order to get access to women. This is the stereotype of the clergy you see in Shui Hu Zhuan and other things in Jinping Mei as eating meat and guzzling wine and having sex with women and so on. I mean, in other words, being the opposite of what they pretend to be. It strikes me that this stereotype is actually a variation on the paradigm of the cross-dressing sexual predator. There are many, many examples in fiction, but also in late Qing newspaper accounts. Here's an example from 警世斋画报, which was also written with the Shen Bao. This is from about 1890 in Shanghai. And so we have these Qing newspaper accounts in the late Qing that portray male clergy disguising themselves as women for the purpose of sexual predation. We don't need to go into this in detail, but there's a Yao Seng named Bao Zhen, about 20 years old, who came to Shanghai and pretended to be this Li Huizhen, dressed as a woman, pierced his ears, dressed his hair in the manner of a woman, and so on and so forth. Wu Xiang Fu Ren, right? And then it goes on and on. Finally, it was exposed. And here's the illustration from 解释斋画报, which is intriguing. 要生男装女扮游街示众, right? And this took place in the Fazujie, the French concession. So you see there's a French policeman on the left. So they're being paraded through the French concession to show the people in this sort of double jiahao, right? And on the left, you have the 男扮女装 figure, and on the right, you have a male accomplice, supposedly. So if you look at 解释斋画报 and Shenbao, you can find stories like this. Actually, there are quite a few. So there was a similar fear that attached to eunuchs. In other words, there was this paranoid fantasy that an uncastrated male might sneak into the palace in order to have sex with the emperor's women. If you know your Shiji, there's the story of Lao Ai in the Liu Buwei biography. That's probably the locus classicus for this story. There's another fear that a real eunuch might be able to use black magic by eating human fetuses or something else like that in order to regenerate his castrated genitalia. Again, also in order to have sex with the emperor's women. So in the Qing palace, this was taken very seriously. All of the eunuchs were subjected to physical exams twice a year in order to make sure that neither of these things had happened, and that all the eunuchs were really eunuchs. So they took this very seriously. Even the cross-dressing actors of the opera, the Dan, Hua Dan, were to some degree objects of suspicion. The idea was that they were femme fatale, and they could act as spies. They could manipulate their infatuated patrons, who were elite men, government officials, and so on, in order to learn confidential information and use it for some evil purpose. So this notion of the predator and masquerade is sort of a common thread that unites all of these things, I think. Now, if we look at the law, cross-dressing in Ming-Qing law, the Ming and Qing legal codes contain no law that explicitly addresses cross-dressing. So in fact, this phrase, 男扮女装, for a male to masquerade in female attire, appears nowhere in either legal code, which is not to say that such behavior was permitted. When these cases came to official attention, they were prosecuted under this statute, 左道异端煽惑人民. This was the statute against using heterodox doctrines to provoke and deceive the people. It's notable that this statute appears in the Code's chapter of crimes related to the Li Bu, Board of Rights, rather than the Xing Bu, the Board of Punishments. I think that this categorization in the Board of Rights underscores the cosmic and ideological implications of the crimes that it was cited to prosecute. Now, this is the text of the statute. This concept of 左道异端煽惑人民, using heterodox doctrines to provoke and deceive the people, seems rather vague. But the statute and its commentary list a number of specific crimes that it covered. Participating in heterodox religious sects that were banned, and some of them are named here. Practicing black magic, engaging in spirit possession and making incantations, cheating people out of their money through quack medicine, faith healing, other confidence schemes, and so on. The penalty was death by strangulation for a main offender and life, exile, or military slavery for the accomplices. This just summarizes what I just said. We can skip that. The statute was usually cited to prosecute religious sects that were deemed to be heterodox, in other words, 邪教, such as the notorious Bailian Jiao. Right? Also, sworn brotherhoods, triads like the Tiandi Hui. These groups were believed to be inherently seditious, and therefore they were usually prosecuted under this statute. It was also cited sometimes to prosecute a variety of religious practices that were deemed heterodox, including faith healing, spirit possession, and the worship of animal spirits. And it's important to note that many of these practices were simply ordinary features of religion in rural China, everywhere in rural China. And the Qing Dynasty did not have the resources to suppress these practices in any kind of systematic way. But when individuals who were ritual specialists who did these things came to official attention, they might be persecuted in a kind of sporadic way. This would be the statute that was cited. Now, it's important to note that this statute nowhere mentions cross-dressing. It does not say anything about 男扮女装. So why apply the statute to this crime? Well, the connection appears to be fraud, this notion of fraud. If we look at imperial ideology in the Ming-Qing period, basically it held that the common people are loyal and good, but they are simple and gullible. They are easily deceived. And just as Confucian orthodoxy, the zhengdao is the truth, heterodoxy, 左道 or 邪教, is a fraud. Therefore, the leaders of heterodox sects are con men, and their supposed beliefs are simply lies intended to deceive ordinary people so that they can be exploited for money, exploited for sex, exploited for seditious purposes, and so on. Right? Similarly, the only plausible reason Qing officials could imagine for a man to, quote, pretend, unquote, to be a woman was to insinuate himself into female space in order to rape or seduce the chaste wives and daughters of good family. Again, a kind of fraud for a nefarious purpose. So the common theme between this crime and heterodoxy was deception or fraud in order to further some evil predatory scheme. So as the Board of Punishment observed in an 1819 case, quote, in the past, this board has adjudicated cases of male masquerading in female attire in the following manner. In any case that involved the violation or seduction of women or swindling the common people out of their money, the offenders have always been sentenced to strangulation, according to the statute against 左道异端煽惑人民, using heterodox doctrines to provoke and deceive the people. In other words, cross-dressing in this kind was linked to heterodoxy by a web of associations between deceit, swindling, seduction, and black magic. If we go a layer deeper in ideology, here is the Board of Rights, the Li, which is one of the canonical texts that was memorized by all educated men in the Ming-Qing era. And here, in a famous passage, we have 男女有别，然后父子亲，父子亲，然后一生，一生，然后礼作，礼作，然后万物安，无别无异，请受之道也。So when male is distinguished from female, blah, 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 without distinction between the sexes, there is no sense of moral duty, and that is the way of animals, right? So in other words, the distinction between the sexes, 男女有别, and then their socialization into the appropriate gendered social roles of the family. This is what distinguishes human beings from animals, civilization from chaos. Right? So here we have the essence really of Confucian orthodoxy. The foundation of a civilized moral order is the distinction between the sexes, their socialization to gendered kinship roles, structured by the rites or rituals of Li, which are the norms that properly govern human relations. So according to this design, males, as they mature, would pursue a centrifugal category, an outward trajectory, whereas females would pursue a centripetal or inward trajectory. Ideally, at about age 6, boys would emerge from the inner female quarters of the household to be educated under the supervision of their father and participate in the worldly sphere of work and state service. At the same age, girls would have their ears pierced, their feet bound, and henceforth they would be increasingly cloistered. Male and female would be reunited upon marriage, and orthodox gender relations were defined by normative marriage rules. All women were to be wives and mothers, all men to be husbands and fathers. And in the 18th and 19th centuries especially, female chastity was a central value defined by absolute lifelong loyalty to one husband. And from that standpoint, normative sexual relations were defined as conjugal relations within a legitimate marriage, all other sexual relations being prohibited. Again, as the Book of Rights warns, without distinction between the sexes, there's no sense of moral duty, and that is the way of animals. So this mention of animals brings us to the second case of Liu Xingshi, who served as a spirit medium to a female fox spirit in order to heal women's illnesses. This case dates to the spring of 1807, when the military police, the Bujun Tongliyan, who were responsible for security in Beijing, the imperial capital, they arrested a woman named Liu Xingshi in a nearby village just outside Beijing. They had heard that this woman practiced faith healing for sick women by channeling a fox spirit, uttering incantations, and burning incense. Suspecting heterodoxy, the police arrested her, along with her husband named Liu Liu. The police found Xingshi's appearance to be unusual. To their eyes, she looked like a man dressed as a woman. So they ordered a midwife to examine Xingshi, and the midwife reported that they had what the midwife deemed to be male anatomy. And then Xingshi confessed to having, quote, masqueraded in female attire, unquote, for more than 20 years. As a boy, their name had been Xingda. Now, interesting detail, their husband, Liu Liu, expressed astonishment at this revelation because he claimed that he had had no idea that his wife had a male body. So, I mean, this was quite a surprise to the police, and they didn't really believe it, but they did note it in their report to the emperor. So according to Xing's confession to the police, they had been orphaned as a child, taken off the street by a man named Hong Da, who provided food and shelter in exchange for sex. Hong Da used them for sex, promising to provide their support. And when Xing turned 15, Hong told Xing to grow out their hair, pierce their ears, and dress as a woman in order to pose as Hong's wife, in this way to facilitate their long-term relationship. So from then on, Xing wore women's clothing, stayed indoors most of the time, doing women's work such as spinning and sewing, and presented himself as Hong's wife. Now, in 1802, when Xing was 29, their partner Hong fell ill with tuberculosis, could no longer support them. So the couple agreed that Hong would marry Xing off to another man. So pretending that Xing was his widowed sister, Hong engaged a matchmaker who arranged for Xing Da to marry a laborer named Liu Liu, her husband, when they were arrested. Liu Liu paid a bride price of 25 strings of cash. And according to their testimony, Xing was so convincing as a woman that the matchmaker, husband Liu Liu, and Liu Liu's parents and older brother were all deceived. They believed that Xing was indeed a woman. Now note the double deception here. Husband Liu Liu believed that he was marrying a widow. He did not know that Xing had in fact been living as Wong's wife, but also he did not know that Xing had male anatomy, and apparently never discovered this until they were arrested and Xing was exposed by the midwife. Now you may be wondering what happened on their wedding night. According to their confession, Xing covered up their wubianchu, their inconvenient place, and by wrapping themselves up, and then told their new husband that because of an illness, they could not have vaginal intercourse, but they offered anal intercourse instead. Liu Liu believed the story and consummated their marriage by penetrating Xing anally. And from then on, their conjugal relations always involved anal intercourse. And again, according to both of their confessions, Liu Liu really believed this and had no idea there was any untruth to it. Now, 2 years later, Xing Shi was visited in a dream by a Niu Wuxian, a female fox spirit, who had chosen them to act as their medium in order to cure women's illnesses. Xing announced this fact to their husband and in-laws and actually went into a trance, being possessed by the fox spirit. So the fox spirit actually spoke through their mouth directly to Liu Liu and Liu Liu's parents and brother. Liu Liu found this very intimidating, and he agreed to this plan. But his parents and brother were shocked and horrified, and they said, no, you can't do this. You cannot be a spirit medium for a fox spirit. So a big row ensued with this fox spirit who had possessed Liu Xingshi, smashing up the house and causing a big scene. And finally, Xingshi compelled their husband to sever ties with his parents and brother and to move out. So the couple lived on their own so that Xingshi could pursue their new vocation as a spirit medium and healer. Now, it's interesting that at this point, according to their confessions, Xingshi stopped having sex with husband Liu Liu and devoted himself entirely to serving the fox spirit as a medium. And it's clear that this new vocation as a spirit medium empowered Xingshi in a way that really transformed their marriage and put them in charge of their household. It's also striking that Xingshi was able to force their husband to cut ties with his own parents in order to follow her. It suggests a powerful personality and quite a bit of charisma. So Xingshi set up an altar in their home with a spirit tablet, a painted image of the fox to worship. And then when women in the area fell ill and they asked Xing to treat them, Xing would go to their home, burn incense, and channel the fox spirit. The spirit would question the patient, diagnose their illness, and then Xingshi would prepare a mixture of tea and other ingredients for the patient to drink. And during these rituals, husband Liu Liu would act as their assistant. For each session, the couple received a couple of hundred cash, not a lot of money, but a little bit of money. And when they were arrested, they had been practicing faith healing in this manner for 2 or 3 years. So this is all what they confessed to the police when they were arrested. But the police pressed them about this question of whether they had raped or seduced any women, and how many. And Xingshi and Liu Liu absolutely denied having used this masquerade for the purpose of raping or seducing women. So the police get this case, they interrogate and they get this information, these confessions, and they write a report to the Board of Punishment and to the Emperor. And they noted their skepticism about the confession. They said they didn't believe that Xing and Liu had never seduced or raped women, but also they did not believe Liu Liu's statement that during 5 years of marriage, he had never realized that Xingshi had male anatomy. They assumed these were lies and that Liu Liu must be an accomplice, not only in this faith-healing swindle, but also in the gender masquerade. And so the police turned this over to the Board of Punishment, the Xingbu, with a recommendation that the 2 culprits be strenuously interrogated. So on the emperor's orders, the Xingbu, the Board of Punishment, took over the case. And the presiding officials observed that for Xingda, quote, to pretend to channel a fox spirit, to make a fake portrait of that spirit, and to pretend to treat illnesses by looking at incense, already constituted capital offenses deserving the death penalty. On top of that, however, Qing had, quote, dared to dress his hair like a woman's and to wear women's clothing. So, quote, it is obvious he must have used women for illicit sexual purposes. But Qing and Liu persisted in their denials, so the interrogators had them tortured with the jiagun, the ankle press. The jiagun is this device made of pieces of wood strapped on the lower legs that would then be tightened with cords. And if taken to an extreme, it would actually crush the bones. It was extremely painful. This was used on men. When women were interrogated under torture, they would use the zan, which was a finger press. So the fact that the jiagun was used shows that they had already sort of assigned male to this person. So they were tortured, and under torture, they did change their story in a couple of ways. So at first, according to the new confession, Qing had indeed tried to conceal their sex from Liu Liu and persuaded him to have anal instead of vaginal intercourse. But eventually, as the two became more intimate, Liu discovered the truth. At first, Liu Liu was very unhappy to realize he had married a man, according to this story. But Qing promised to serve him and support him faithfully for the rest of their 2 lives. And finally, Liu acquiesced. He was seduced and persuaded by Qing's words and charming manner. And in the days that followed, Qing Da also seduced Liu into alternating sexual roles in anal intercourse. And they became passionately devoted to each other and spent every single night together, again, according to this confession under torture. And note how this diverges from the first set of confessions, in which both testified, first of all, that Liu Liu did not know that Qing Shi had a male anatomy, and second, that once Qing began channeling the fox spirit, they stopped all sexual activity. Now, second, they confessed under torture that Qing Shi, with Liu Liu's help, was operating a confidence scheme. The channeling of the fox spirit was in fact a fraud to swindle people out of their money. So this is how the confessions changed under torture. In other respects, however, they stuck to their original testimony, even under severe torture. As the Board of Punishment reported to the emperor, quote, he, meaning Qing, he insists that he has never had sex with any woman and says that given everything else he has confessed, he would have no reason to conceal it if he had done so. The Board of Punishment reported that they found this story to be unbelievable, but also that ultimately there was no point in torturing them further because Qing had already confessed to other capital crimes. So instead of dragging out the process, they could close the case and put him to death. The emperor approved. So Qing Shi was sentenced to immediate strangulation, 绞立决, and as an accomplice, Liu Liu was sentenced to military slavery in Xinjiang for the rest of his life. Now, I will start to wrap this up. I've used a lot of time already. The striking detail in these cases and in some others that I have in my book is that the protagonists engaged in healing work for women. Xiongmumu practiced midwifery, and Qing channeled a fox spirit for the same purpose, to heal women. It seems obvious there must have been some connection between their crossing of gender boundaries, their transing of gender, and these healing activities. If you think about it, both midwifery, which is the delivery of children into this world, and the shamanistic power to channel spirits, both of these practices involve a highly potent crossing of boundaries with powerfully gendered and symbolic implications. Qing Shi's channeling of the fox spirit strikes me as one of the most intriguing examples. Fox spirits play a rich role in Chinese popular religion and folklore. In North China in particular, including the environs of Beijing, the fox is one of the Sidamen, 4 animal deities that are worshipped by rural people, often at small altars in their homes. The others are weasel, hedgehog, snake. There's some variation from place to place. All of these deities were shapeshifters who could appear either as animals or in human form, and either as men or as women. All of these deities were accessed through spirit mediums who would practice healing, divination, and exorcism. They were capricious spirits. They could be very mischievous. They could cause trouble, but if treated with respect and propitiated, they could be very helpful. They could do much good. Traditionally, the fox is portrayed as a maternal deity, often in this form of Wuxian Yang Yang. This is one of many versions. And these are modern images of Wuxian Yang Yang. Wuxian Yang Yang has the power to heal illnesses. She's also a source of wealth and good fortune. And most of the mediums who channeled fox spirits were poor women, and they are still at poor women. This fox spirit cult is alive and well in rural China. These were women living at the bottom of the social scale, but they achieved status and a measure of power and respect for their healing services. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that the fox spirit would have served as this tutelary deity for Qing Shi, where the Qing Shi was able to act as a medium for this deity. Despite the torture-driven confession of fraud, Qing Shi's account of their work with the fox spirit closely matches the evidence gathered in the 20th century by ethnographers and religious scholars doing field work in rural North China. It seems clear, at least to me, that Qing Shi's vocation as a spirit medium was genuine. This religious vocation also recalls the tradition in other Chinese religious sects where male mediums will channel female deities, vice versa. And during this kind of spirit mediumship, they will undergo a temporary change of gender by adopting the mannerisms and speaking in the voice of the deity of the other gender. We are also reminded, as I mentioned a moment ago, of the sacred qualities attributed to gender variant individuals in some other cultures, Native American cultures and so on. All of these people play special ritual roles for their communities. Their gender variance is a chief qualification for those roles. It is a sign that they've been touched by the divine. In other words, Qing Shi's transing of gender may well have enhanced their affinity for the role of spirit medium as two extraordinary abilities that paralleled each other and confirmed each other. Qing's male body already served as a vessel for a woman's persona. It seems a logical next step for it to serve as a vehicle for a female spirit to become manifest and act in the world. Possession by the fox would in turn have confirmed Qing Shi in their role as a woman. It also clearly empowered them vis-a-vis both their family and their community, making them a figure of authority who dominated their husband. So in conclusion, there's no way for us to know for sure the subjective consciousness or self-perception of these individuals who lived as women at great risk and whose transgender lives eventually attracted the malign attention of the Qing government. It's clear, however, that a huge gap separated those individuals' motives and desires from the straitjacket of official expectations that were informed by this paradigm of the cross-dressing sexual predator. That paranoid fantasy attempted to make sense of a gender performance that radically conflicted with normative masculinity. An ulterior motive explained it. The apparent embrace of femininity was, in fact, a disguise for that definitive form of dangerous masculinity, namely the aggressive penetrator who respects no ritual boundaries. Behind the veil of feminine artifice, Qing officials discovered the all too easily comprehensible threat of male sexual aggression against women. Ultimately, then, this paranoid fantasy of the cross-dressing predator reflects anxiety less about gender inversion per se, than about the vulnerability of chaste daughters and wives, which was the true obsession of the Qing judiciary with regard to sex. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to Professor Young's comments and to any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sommer. Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Sommer, for this fantastic talk. And now let's welcome Professor Yang for the discussion.
Thank you for having me here. I have to say that this is also like deja vu to me. I was telling Professor Shaw and Professor Sommer that I was a graduate student when I went to the talk of Professor Sommer on his first book. That was back in like 20 years ago. So I'll just briefly share how I continue to learn from his wonderful scholarship. So back then, I was fascinated by the opening up of new archives in Beijing and how it generated all this new exciting research. Especially the topic of bear sticks was like mind-blowing to me. If I remember correctly, there was much discussion about the overlap between the legal documents and what we call fictional tales today. So I think that overlap is really key to our understanding of this current new book. So there's this phrase that I especially like. he uses feedback loop. It's like basically the writers and readers of fiction in the Qing period, Yuan Mei included, they were sharing the same kind of mentality and worldviews with the judiciary and government officials. So that's how their imaginations were fitting into each other and reinforcing each other to such an extent that they grow into this dominant fantasy, paranoid, what you call the script. So in the interrogations, we actually see how the interrogators were following a script or coaxing a narrative from the convicts according to their assumptions or preconceptions. So that's really eloquent to me. Regarding the stories themselves, I have to say, I think I've read the Sanchong story. I think I recall it somehow. And I used to think I'm a big fan of Liao Zhai, but I didn't read the Liao Zhai stories that way. I guess it's because the Sanchong story in particular just didn't make much sense. It's hard to make sense. I think the main reason behind it is because we just don't know what it wants to convey, right? Is it real? It's too strange to be real. But now in light of the legal documents and the sort of, the feeding back into each other, the stories feedback loop, it suddenly becomes clear to me how the story should be approached, even as a literature student. So that's the second point I wanted to share. Also, we find the afterlife of all these major cases that you discuss in your book. Now we are moving to the modern press of the Huabao. I myself is a big fan of that pictorial. You find all kinds of sensational portrayals of people. You made a cogent case of how they actually drew from the zhiguai genre, but also they were echoing the legal documents. So I guess my question here is, I'm just curious whether you would plan to go further into the popular press, because the Huabao is sort of elite. When we have the really mass media following the 1911 revolution, and you have the different kind of legal system too. So how would you find the interaction of the legal and the popular imagination in that period? I guess that's pretty much it. I'll just ask one more question on behalf of my new graduate student. She was asking me how to come up with good research ideas and how to put ideas into, combine them into solid scholarship, and also to come up with a good narrative sometimes. So I would wonder how you would describe your work process, how you work with all these ideas, and how you straddle law and literature. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for your generous comments. So yes, the feedback loop, this is something that I think is really interesting and has intrigued me for a long time, because in reading Qing Dynasty legal cases, and I've read a lot, often you can notice that the crime that someone commits seems to be following a cultural script. I mean, you think about it, if someone is going to commit a crime like a murder, I mean, maybe it's just spontaneous, but maybe they already have in their mind the idea, well, if I'm going to do that, this is how I go about doing it. Right? And then where does that idea come from? So, for example, I've seen a lot of cases involving revenge killing. And in these cases, what do? Well, so there's a case I have of someone who murders his father's concubine. I'll be talking about this a little bit tomorrow in the seminar I'm going to do. But in that case, this young man is very troubled. He kills the concubine, then he cuts her head off, then he goes to his mother's altar, where her Mengpai is, and he burns incense to his mother because he says later that his mother ordered him to kill the concubine to take revenge because basically, so 父母命杀妾, this is what he claims. And so he takes the concubine's head, he burns incense and prays to his mother, and he puts the head up and he says, Mother, I've taken revenge for you. And then he takes the head in his hand and the knife and he goes to the Xianyamen and turns himself in. Well, this is right out of 水浒传. This is Song, right? This is like, and you know, in opera and Baihua Xiaoshuo and so on, there are plenty of examples like this. And so clearly this young man has this notion. This is what a Nanzehan does, right? If you're going to take revenge, you're going to act in a righteous way. So, I mean, that's a kind of an obvious example, but it seemed to me so for example, this question I started beginning, how does the governor know? How does he know for sure there's a sex predator? You don't even have to ask, we already know. How does he know? He knows because of this sort of collectively created image that is in the popular literature, the popular culture. It's in the way legal cases have been treated before, the way legal cases turn into fiction and back and forth. And somehow, by the time you get to the 18th century, sort of like everybody knows that this is what this means, right? So I find that intriguing. And it seems to me this is a particular case where that is very powerful. And I think analogies can be drawn to witchcraft trials in Europe or America. Again, the fact that in these cases, to get a satisfactory confession, they have to torture the people because the people don't really know what to say to satisfy the interrogators unless they're sort of coached. And so if you read these confessions, it really seems like the interrogators and the people being interrogated are talking past each other. Like in the case of the fox spirit medium, this person says, I've never had sex with a woman. What are you talking about? Let alone done all these things that you accuse me of doing, right? That you somehow know I've done. So it really, the same thing you have in witchcraft trials, right? The use of torture to force the person to confess to being a witch and to produce a narrative that satisfies the image that the interrogators already have of what a witch is, how a witch behaves. So I found that interesting. I think maybe people in the literary side could do more with this. I feel like I just sort of scratched the surface. In the case of sanctioned, did you have a question about sanctioned? No, okay. Popular press. I don't think I'm going to go further, but I think, you know, 大有文章可做, a lot of opportunities here. You have this flourishing popular press that begins in the late, what is it, the 1870s, I think, 申报 and 地质战画报, but all the way down, certainly to 1949. 申报 lasts until 1949. And a lot of these newspapers, including 申报, are available on searchable databases online. Probably you go to your library, you have access to these things. And so you can, what I did is I did keyword searches. I did keyword searches for things like 男扮女装 and so on, but also things like 阴阳人 and 人妖 and 上冲 and 木兰, you know, these very, and then I got all of these, I mean, huge number of hits from these things. And I just cited a few cases in the book, and I only looked at ones that were from the late Qing. But one of the striking things in the popular press, the little bit I read, is that in the 20th century, in the Ming-Guo period, you do start to get modern sexology and new kinds of medical and psychiatric concepts and vocabulary coming in. But this old stuff continues right down into the 1940s. So it's like there's a weird coexistence between this new layer of discourse that's imported and these traditional concepts. I mean, there are even cases in like 1947 to 48, 49, where they're talking about 人妖 and 男扮女装 and so on. So there's a ton of material there. So I think that there's certainly somebody should write a dissertation on this. I don't know if anyone out there wants to take this, but you know, there's at least one PhD dissertation in the popular press image of transgender, probably more than that, I would guess. A lot to do. But I'm not going to do any more with that, I don't think. In terms of my work process, that's a big question. For this book, also, first of all, I got interested in legal cases because of the stories. And I got interested in the cases about sex and gender and family because the stories were so colorful and interesting. And also, they shed light on the lives of ordinary people, most of whom were illiterate. They did not leave diaries and letters and so on. And so, but it was really the stories were so interesting to me. And in the case of this book, I had encountered these cases that all of them were sort of anomalous and didn't fit any pattern. I encountered them by accident while I was looking for other things. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I don't really understand this. And I would copy it and put it aside. And over time, these things accumulated that I had copied and put aside. And because also at the same time, you had other scholars working on transgender history, how to conceptualize this. Susan Stryker, I mentioned. That book of hers came out only in 2008, which to someone my age is like yesterday. And that book really, for the first time, I think, laid a stable conceptual foundation for thinking about transgender as history. So it's very important work. And then, of course, transgender issues, transgender people have been in the media and legal issues around this. So now there's this terrible, in my country, this terrible persecution and backlash against transgender people is going on. It's a terrible thing. But there's no question that that background, both of scholarship coming out that influenced my thinking, and then also of these political and social issues, this influenced the way this book came out. 20 years ago, I could not have imagined this book, let alone written it, but it was only because of these other things that came together, and the material that I put aside started to make sense, started to come into focus, if you will. I don't know if that answers the question about work process, but this book in particular, it's not like I planned to do this. It was rather late in the process. I realized maybe this would work as a book. And I wrote it during COVID, which was perfect because I was under, Ranjin in my house. And I could do nothing but write. So it worked out rather well that way. Maybe.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I really recommend, because for Sommer talking about the writing during the COVID, and for this book, if you have to have the chance to read this book, I will recommend the introduction, the acknowledgement part of this book. It's writing about the writing during the COVID and working around the Stanford and with the family, and it's very, really touching stories, and I really love that. Okay, so we are going to open the floor for the questions, and we will do each block every time. Okay, so ensure everyone have the chance. And so from that block, any questions so far? Yes.
女扮男装。Right. Sort of a Mulan gone wrong. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking a question. It's an important question, which I did not address at all in the talk, hoping and assuming it would come up in the questions. So if you look at like Shenbao and the other newspapers, I found like a couple references to Yuban Hakon, but very little. In the legal texts, legal cases, legal codes, legal commentaries, I have never seen any mention of it at all. Zero. Nothing. And so that sort of begs the question, why not? And it's hard to explain why something does not exist, because they don't tell you why it doesn't exist. So you have to make an educated guess. I mean, on a most basic level, I think that there's this misogynist notion that what men do is more important than what women do. And sexual acts, whether legitimate or illegitimate, were understood as a male acting upon a female, or a male acting upon a feminized male object. That was the way it was constructed in the law. And so in this case, the focus really is this paranoid fantasy of the male masquerading as a female in order to get access to women. And so one of the things that strikes me about this is the judges are not interested in whether these people had sex with men. Like, that's beside the point. We don't care. You know, how many women have you raped? From a kind of modern perspective, it's quite odd. You know, at first when I read this, I did not know what to make of it at all. On the other hand, it does seem to be really all about the threat of this man to what was seen as normative gender relations in the family, especially the chaste wife. They always say this, that is what they care about. And so, you know, again, in my earlier work, I talked about the guanggun. I think Professor Yang mentioned this, the so-called pair of sticks. I mean, the guanggun in the 18th century was imagined to be this dire threat to social order. And that in part reflected a social reality. We did have this, you know, Qing and all this sort of thing, and you know, these poor men tended to be overrepresented in criminal cases, bandits and so on. But the guanggun was imagined to be this sexual threat, this predator. And you know, the term guanggun is very phallic. And gun was slang. If you read Jinping, gun is slang for a penis, right? So guanggun has this very vivid imagery as a sexual threat to the chaste wives and daughters and the young boys in good families. And so, in a way, this fear of the男扮女装seems like a variation on a theme, a very pervasive theme at this time in the law. So I guess that's my answer. Now, I should say that I have also never seen any reference to sex between women in any legal source of any kind for the imperial era. So, I mean, it was not defined as a crime, but it was never even mentioned as far as I can tell. And believe me, I've looked. So if anyone finds something, please tell me. I'm very interested, but I've never found any mention in any legal text from the imperial era of sex between women. Now, does that mean women never had sex? No, it does not mean that. What it means is that, again, this sort of phallocentrism really went down deep. And what two women did together was not necessarily even defined as sexual for purposes of law, right? But rather it was, and you see this in literature. So there, in literature, in fiction and drama, you do have episodes where there's sex and love between women. Usually these are written by men for a male audience. So we may be in the realm of male fantasy here, but at least it was thinkable. But you know, typically, the typical scenario is that you have a relationship between a zhengqi, a main wife, and a qie, a concubine, contained within a polygynous marriage, where they have the same husband. And maybe it's resolved when the husband takes the concubine and then they have a Dutch wife. But in the fiction, usually it seems to me the relations between the women are trivialized and, you know, safely contained, you might say, within marriage in a way that it does not threaten the sexual and reproductive privileges of the man, the husband. So in a sense, this is maybe something trivial or cute or tantalizing, or titillating, but nothing very important or dangerous. So that also sort of, I think, gives a clue into how these things were understood. But again, it's maybe not possible to say for sure why something does not exist. You can only speculate. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. So for this block, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Huge thank you to Professor Sommer for your wonderful talk today on this very intriguing and timely subject. I actually have two main questions for you, but like, do we need to like pass it on after the first one? Oh, okay. I'll try to make it short and sweet. So my first question is about another fictional tale regarding male to female cross-dressing. So you acknowledge the feedback loop between the real-life legal persecution of transgender individuals and the sensationalized, reinterpreted versions of them in Zhiguai stories written by the likes of Songling and Wu Chichang, which often reinforce the sexual predator paradigm. Now, you're probably familiar with the collection notes of the thatched abode of those observations, 阅微草堂笔记 by Ji Yun, which also belongs to the genre of the strange, in which there's the story 滦阳萧下路二, which seems to diverge from the Sangchong script while kind of bearing resemblance to it. So to quickly summarize the story, during the Ming, two eunuchs fleeing political prosecution are coerced by the man granting them asylum into dressing as women and masquerading as his concubines. The reason being that their non-conformism will be less noticeable, basically. And the eunuchs go through the stock process of getting their ears pierced and binding their feet, but not learning women's handiwork, and everything goes according to plan. So the man who coerced them is later damned to punishment in the afterlife for being a rapist, and the eunuchs are acquitted of wrongdoing. So there are several striking aspects in the story, in my opinion, compared to other tales about gender crossing like Ren Yao. So, for example, the sexual coercion actually receiving acknowledgement. The male to female cross-dressers are not flatly virtuous or lecherous, and the penetrating male in this situation is solely condemned, and the deities passing out judgment make it clear that cross-dressing for survival can be forgiven. So in a way, it reads like an alternative outcome to Xing Shi's story. So my question is, how would you interpret this tale in the context of Qing conceptions of gender? So like, would it have been different if the eunuchs were intact men? Does it speak to how rape of gender crossing individuals would have been perceived outside of script? Is the hierarchy between intact male and eunuch in this story meaningfully reminiscent of the master-disciple dynamic that's usually used in the script? So this is my first question. I'm curious about your thoughts.
So I haven't read the story, but it sounds really interesting. Would you mind emailing me the reference?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a second question?
Well, let me try to answer this first. But I don't know. I mean, I'm speculating, but you know, 绝怪小说 is very rich and diverse. I mean, there also not everyone necessarily thought about everything exactly the same way. Right? I mean, one of the things that 白话小说 provided was an opportunity to step outside official language and official values and ideas. So it seems to me when you're looking at popular literature, on the one hand, these are all basically, almost all basically men who've received the same Confucian education. And some of the most famous authors of fiction were actually officials, like Yuan Mei and Ling Mengchu, there are others, right? And so, in a sense, when they step outside official language, the official role, and they're writing fiction, they're sort of like slumming almost. You can sort of, you know, take off the official outfit and try out something, right? But so you have a variety, and it may well be that there are other alternatives, but I would guess, though, that this story is written against the background of the sanctioned stereotype. In other words, the author and the readers know about that. And this is being presented as an exceptional situation, which is different from that, right? And yet, in a sense, the premise is that everyone knows the stereotype. And you know, so for example, there's a Pusongling story, I think it's called Ren Yao. It's in Liaozhai, where one of Sang Chong's disciples who escaped is caught when he's trying to rape a woman, caught by the woman's husband who tries to rape him. And then they both realize simultaneously they have male anatomy, and then the husband grabs this young man, and instead of turning him into the authorities, he castrates him. And then once he heals, makes him into his female concubine. And this way sort of tames him and domesticates him. And that also has a kind of happy ending where this problem is resolved by turning this person into a woman, in effect. Kind of, it's like a 变性手术, you might say, of the way it's presented. And so that's again a kind of variation which doesn't strictly fit, even though it derives from the Sang Chong story, because this person is said to be one of Sang Chong's disciples. But the ending is quite different, right? And so I think that there you have a variety of possibilities. So what do you think of the story? How would you interpret it?
Yeah, because I feel like the ending difference with Ren Yao is what made me intrigued in it in the first place. Because I mean, in the end, it's still a story about subjugation, and it doesn't really like break out of the mold of like these effeminate men being sexually exploited and like accepting of their concubine role, because in the story it explicitly states that the eunuchs are so grateful for their lives being saved that they really don't care that they're being exploited. Like also, I guess like sexual exploitation is somewhat recurring in notes of attached abode. So I think that might speak to like what Ji thinks is notable as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I'd like to read it.
My other question, I guess there's also a follow-up question to it. So it's more about the execution of transphobia within and outside of a legal framework rather than as a set of beliefs and stereotypes. So we see that people who transgender in late Imperial China were susceptible to harsh punishment through the legal system and outside of the courtroom. They were vulnerable to grooming, sex trafficking, disownment, and rape. It's all cases that you've written about in your book. And all of these are still more or less still experienced by trans feminine individuals in China and wider Asia today, maybe notably Southeast Asia. So I want to ask, like, what do you think is the relationship between these phenomena over the ages, and how should the transphobic framework in the Qing and to some extent the Ming inform our understanding of legislation protecting or persecuting trans individuals in this part of Asia in the modern day? And I guess some things that come to mind, like torture, regendering as seen in the case of Xiongwu, or like in modern day, if you want to like change your gender legally, you need to go through sexual reassignment surgery in many places. So what do you think?
That's a tall order. How can we change the world? That's a good question. I don't mean to laugh at the question. It's a very important question. I'm not sure I have a very adequate answer. I think that the history is useful for a couple of reasons. One is to show what is different from what is familiar today, but also to show there's some important parallels. The kind of persecution, the kind of paranoid fantasy of the cross-dressing predator, the way trans women in particular are targeted, treated so harshly. The process of forced disclosure of the genitalia, which then leads to this violence. I mean, there are a lot of interesting parallels with, I think, experiences that people have today. But I think it's also important to look at this material and realize that, I mean, it's only like lifting the corner of a rug and you get a glimpse of the reality underneath there. But what you see is that there were transgender people who existed in the Ming-Qing period. There were individuals who were assigned male at birth who decided to live as women at great risk and make a conscious decision to change how their hair presented. That, you know, that really involves something. You had to grow out your hair all the way, right? How do you do that? So you remember Xiongwu, according to their story, they told everyone they decided to become a nun. That means you shave the whole head. From that point, it's easy to grow everything out the same length. But presumably prior to that, Xiong had a male tonsure, front shaved and the bianzi, right? So how do you, I mean, you can't just like switch your hair. So this involved a certain amount of thought and planning and strategizing. Right? Also, they had to acquire a female code. So to me, this is, I mean, something modestly heroic, you might say, about this, that in spite of all the odds, you had people who were motivated to do this, to be true to themselves, presumably, and then they did it. And the other thing I would say, and I argue this in the epilogue, is that, first of all, there are very few cases I can find in the legal archives of Namban Yuzhuang being prosecuted. Does that mean that this happened extremely rarely? Well, I don't know. I mean, I can't prove how often it happened. It doesn't lend itself to quantitative analysis. And I suspect that for every case that ended up being prosecuted and leaving a record for us to read today, there must have been a lot of other people who did this, who never got in trouble, right? Because there was no reason they would get in trouble. Therefore, they never left any record. And so, for example, in both of the cases I mentioned, these people did not get in trouble because their community complained about them. It was because in the first case, Xiongwu filed this crazy this lawsuit against the brother. If they hadn't done that, we'd never know this person existed, right? There'd be no reason we would know this person existed. I mean, so it's kind of frustrating. You know, they had gotten away with it. They had lived this good life. Why did you? So I don't know why they were motivated to file a lawsuit. In the case of the Fox Media medium, for a shorter period of time, this person also apparently was just fine with their community. The problem is Beijing was the most heavily surveilled and policed place in the entire empire, and not a lot escaped the attention of the police there. And so it was the police who heard about this person and then found out about it and arrested them, and then they had them examined, right? But it wasn't like people in the neighborhood complaining. What that tells me is that there could have been a lot of other people, perhaps living in villages, perhaps playing ritual roles, who knows, like these people did, who never left any trace in the record because they never came to the attention of authorities because nobody ever complained about them, you know? And so that's why I emphasize at the beginning, you have the demonization and the sacralization. These are, in a sense, the two alternatives that you see. This is simplifying, but you see these in many societies, right? And My guess would be that the sacralization was actually a much more important phenomenon in China than the demonization. And I mean, if you've read any of my work, you realize that I'm very, very skeptical about the reach of the state and about the extent to which imperial ideology and the lifestyle and values of the elite have anything to do with the lives of most people in China during the Ming-Qing period. I think there was this huge gap. So I think that, again, I can't necessarily prove this in any quantitative way, but my belief, what I think the indirect evidence suggests, is that there were probably a lot more people like this living perfectly peaceful lives and perhaps playing useful roles in their communities with respect. And we'll never know about them because they never got in trouble, right? And as far as for a historian, that's frustrating. But for those people, it's just fine that they never left a historical record, right? It means they were never persecuted. They were never put to death in some cruel way. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but
Thank you. Anyways,
but that's sort of how I think about it. As far as how do we fix things now, I honestly don't know. I despair in my own country. Things seem to get worse every day. And but I have to believe that historians have some role to play, perhaps in helping to change attitudes a bit. I have to say, there's a professor at the Poly, Kimberly Tao, some of you may know. I don't know how her name is pronounced in Chinese, but she's involved in pedagogy, investigating pedagogy, and introducing transgender concepts and also introducing transgender people to classes of undergraduates in the context of a class on gender and society as a way of basically exposing students to this reality, to these people, and also changing their attitudes in some way. And that seems to be a very valuable sort of one student at a time kind of approach to opening people's minds. So I would commend her work and bring it to your attention if you don't know about that.
Oh, thank you for your very detailed and thoughtful answer. I have one last question. Sorry. Oh, okay. Next one.
Welcome back to Hong Kong, you, Professor Sommer.
Hi, John, how are you?
來都來啦. I have to ask you a question about that. I guess the obvious parallel is more with Xing, given that you ended with description of sex acts between two male. And it also accentuates, I guess, your observation that both cases show the preoccupation in late Imperial China to protect chaste women. I guess in 2025, the preoccupation has now shifted to protection against otherwise very qualified male. So it's somewhat, I guess, I'm not sure of how much of an observation we want to make with contemporary cases, but yeah. But my question is actually more on the pragmatics, practicality, and also the risk side. In the first case, Xiong went from being a widow, non-sexual, presumably, to a nun, asexual, presumably, to being a midwife. That's a highly gendered business. I'm not sure how much more or less it is compared to Fox Spirits. In terms of practicalities, as you said, the hair thing is a big thing. I'm not sure about this person's hair condition. I would have thought that it's easier to go from tonsure to totally shaven. I'll become a nun.
I think why they said they became a nun.
But then before you become a widow.
They were ever a widow. That was the story they told. That's
okay.
The excuse for becoming a nun. I had to run away from my evil in-laws. They were forcing me to remarry, but I wanted to honor my chastity. And this is this whole discourse of a virtuous woman.
Okay.
And it explains why she's on her own, away from the family.
That makes more sense, I guess, if it's just a story. The risk side, though, is a highly risky business. I guess midwife, you cannot be, well, I presume you cannot be a male to perform that job. I'm not even sure if you can be an unmarried or never married woman to perform that job, can you?
That I don't know, but I don't think there were very many never married women.
So the widow part might have made sense that's part of the story. But you're getting yourself into intimate bodily contact. That would, I guess, make it a riskier business for Xiong.
Why the governor convinced, right? The governor singled us out in this memorial. I didn't quote the whole thing.
Right. I wonder if the risk was somewhat deliberate, especially when you get to the end of it. You talked about this whole historian's frustration of the lack of material. I also wonder if there is a deliberate act to, in a way, to come out. Why would you sue your mom and your brother. They knew your biological sex at birth for sure. You are risking a lot to do that. So I wonder how much of that is to counteract this heavy weight of her or their secret for such a long time. In a way, going back to Hong Jie, it's not just a coming out of Hong Jie, it's a coming out of all the guys who had sex with Hong Jie as well. So I wonder how much of that, if we see it in records, whether it's today's newspapers or in historical records, it is a deliberate act of the transgender to expose something, including at great risk.
This is great. You've raised a lot of issues. So first of all, the midwife, one thing we don't know is what people in their village thought of it. My guess is, because they've been living in this village for 20-some years, and they had, assembled this family and so on, all these ganua. I mean, nobody knew, really? I mean, I suspect a lot of people knew, or at least they knew there was something unusual about this person. But again, as far as we can tell, nobody complained about this. My guess, it's a guess, my guess is that whatever gender ambiguity or whatever it was about this person was seen as enhancing somehow their capacity to midwife. Now, again, that's speculation. The governor already knew what this meant, right? And therefore, the governor was not really interested in any alternative explanation. So, so that's my guess, is that people, or whatever, they knew something was special about this person, and yet this person had a respected role in the community, and apparently was popular, and assembled this family, and no problem. There was no complaints from him. So, again, the governor is horrified and freaks out about this, but nobody in this village did. And so, again, the same thing I think with the Ocean Assured. This person, when the police saw this person, they thought that looks like a man to us, a man dressed as a woman, and that's why they had a midwife examine them. Right? They arrested them because they suspected heterodoxy, but immediately they had a midwife examine because they thought this was, well, if this person visibly appeared masculine, apparently nobody in the community cared, right? And it may well be that ambiguity in some way enhanced. That's why I drew a parallel within these other cultures where you have gender variant individuals who play ritual roles, something special about them. I mean, I could go on about that. There's more in the book, but so that's sort of how I would answer that. But I think that the story that Xiaomeng was told of Hunter Island Village, I was a widow, a chaste widow, and I ran away to avoid being forced to remarry by my evil in-laws. I think that was a lie. I think that was a story they made up too. They had left home in order to transition to live as a woman. Right? And the easiest way to fix the hair was to shave the head of the nun, or to say they were maybe a mendicant nun who was wandering, and then to grow it out in uniform length and say, Huan Su. So that's what I think about that case. But again, this is sort of speculation because there's so little in the case record. The Hongjie case is really interesting. I mean, as soon as that kind of broke in the Chinese media, all of my friends emailed me about this, as you can imagine. This case really actually worries me quite a bit. First of all, I don't believe we have the whole story. What we have is what Chinese media and social media say about it. But according to that account, as I understand it, this is an individual male anatomy who dresses as a woman and then had sex with many male partners and then videotaped them and then was selling these videotapes online for money. I mean, maybe that's true, but I suspect it's not the whole story. If it's true, my guess is, I mean, this sounds like a disturbed individual who maybe was treated very badly at some point in the past. And this is sort of a bizarre way of getting revenge on men. I don't know. I mean, that's a guess. It's just a guess. But what really bothers me about this case is this case has been, it's not been censored, right? It's blown up on social media, becomes a sensational phenomenon, whereas everything else seems to be censored. And this is in a context where LGBT social organizations are being shut down, where the Xiaoxianrou is disappearing from advertising and media, where you have increasingly conformist policies, almost neo-Confucian policies about women being pushed by the government. Now they want women to have three babies. They want women to get married younger, not get divorced, not work outside the home, right? They're pushing that whole line. People who write BL literature and posting on a Taiwan website have been arrested and being prosecuted in China. and much LGBT content is simply being purged from social media, right? That's my understanding. Now, against that background, this one story is allowed to blow up. Why? So my fear is that the story is convenient because it portrays, again, and if you read the Chinese, they use the term 男扮女装. A lot of these tropes that I talked about here from the Ming-Qing period, it all appears in the Chinese social media coverage. In the case of 男扮女装, it's a predator, it's dangerous, masquerade, right? But you're right, in this case, it's straight men who are the victims. Now, I would have to say, I question whether all those are really 100%. I mean, were they all fooled? Really? It's really that simple? Call me skeptical, okay? So that's one point. But it really does make me worry why this story is allowed to become so prominent. What purpose does that serve when you think of the rest of the sort of gender agenda of the current government in China? Now, this is my reaction to it. I don't have any inside information, obviously, but I can't help but wonder, why is this one story allowed to be so big? Maybe other people know more about this and have other perspectives, but thank you for bringing it up. It is much on my mind, I have to say, because it frightens me. It becomes one more excuse for victimizing these people. I mean, most transgender people just want to be left alone. Right? I don't know. I mean, you're right. Why did Sommer file this lawsuit? It seems crazy. I have no explanation. I mean, part of me, there are a couple of explanations I'm saying in the book. One is speculation. One is that they had gotten so used to living in this role for so long without any trouble at all, they became very complacent. And they figured, what's likely to happen? They just assumed the brother would continue to keep the secret. Another thing is that in Qing, when people filed lawsuits, very high percentage of them, people then negotiated settlement. So you go to the Yamen and you doll somebody. That's a way of like raising pressure on a negotiating opponent. And a lot of people at that point would say, okay, they agree on a settlement sometime. So people filed suit, not necessarily intending to go all the way to a court judgment. But in this case, for whatever reason, the brother said, I think, is probably angry. You got all this land in that village. Why do you want my little bit of land here? You want to live as a woman, don't claim a brother's share. So I wonder, I don't know if they knew just how high it was. They probably didn't know what the law said, right? I mean, there's no reason they would. Most people didn't. So it may be that the brother had no idea what kind of trouble he was getting. But it's not just because the brother also was in deep shit. He got punished very severely because he was seen as an accomplice. You kept this secret all these years to facilitate. So the brother was treated very harshly also. So I suspect that neither of them really knew what level of trouble they were getting themselves into. Yeah. But again, this is sort of informed speculation. So, thank you. Oh, I'm done. Thank you. Oh, really? That's one, singing boy. Interesting. Oh, thank you. I had no idea. But thank you so much. I don't really know much about the Ming Dynasty, to be honest with you. I've seen it in general cases, but I don't have an earlier one. I've seen, or they will say they perform the role of Dan.
Yeah.
Dan.
Yeah. And is common. The Song Dynasty already have it, but refer to like they have homosexual meanings. It's yeah.
Great, thank you. Sure, you're the boss.
Thank you very much for the talk. So one question and I think many of my colleagues are asked when we present our work on Asia is, how is Asia different from the West, right? So to what extent does Western theory not apply? What is the cultural specificity of Hong Kong or Singapore or wherever? And one of the things that really struck me in your talk is where you said, well, actually, there's quite a remarkable degree of consistency. Right, that rhetoric of masquerade and deception, that kind of penis as predator logic, it runs through the West and China in the past and present. This intersects with your conversation with John as well. So my question is, how would you respond to these kind of scholars who begin with this presumption of Asia's difference? Do you see them as kind of showing a mark of respect to Asian difference? Do you see them as fetishizing Asia? Is it both? Is it neither? Like, what would you kind of say to them?
Well, I'd start by saying that Asia is pretty diverse in itself. Japan and China are completely different. So, just to cite an example, in the Qing Dynasty, Xinjiang, intercourse with males, that was a crime. In Japan, it was only Beijing. So, very, very different. So I would say that Asia is not the one thing. I guess that's obvious. Aside from that, to me, there are some similarities, For example, I guess I draw the parallel between the Nanban Yuan stereotype of sanctioned and current transphobia. That's the one that really strikes me. I don't know if there was anything in early modern Europe that really corresponds to that as strongly. I don't know. My impression is it was not quite the same. But again, it's not really my area. I've done some secondary reading, but the way these non-binary cases were treated with the sort of the ideological and the cosmic significance attributed to this, and associating with heterodoxy, using torture to extract a confession that meets expectations, and then putting people to death. Right? It's very extreme. And that is more like witchcraft trials or other highly ideologically charged or political crimes. And you can see in other parts of the world. So it strikes me that that's the closest analogy. It's not necessarily that cross-dressing was treated the same way in Europe or America. As far as I know, it wasn't treated as hard. It was not treated well, but it was not treated as harshly. But this really puts it in a different category, the Chinese case, which strikes me. There are analogies in the West of other kinds of crimes that also have some cosmic significance. But it's not the same specific crime. So I'm not sure there's an adequate answer to your question, but just thinking out loud here, I would say that, first of all, Asia is not all the same thing. And I don't know of anything in Japan that corresponds with what I'm talking about Chinese. I have no idea about South Asian, although the Indians have a respected, stigmatized and also respected, very paradoxical role. The ritual specialists who are believed to be able to enhance the fertility of the newborn boy and are brought into rituals, celebration. At the same time, many of them are impoverished sex workers. So it's a paradoxical of that. I guess I would just say that Asia is not one thing, but there are similarities with the West, but also important differences. That's sort of the obvious answer. Thank you. You have the mic there? You can use the mic. I use hearing aids and my hearing is very poor.
So you're using the concept of transgender in your book. So I'm just curious your thoughts of using like such relatively modern and Western term in late imperial Chinese concept, because I'm also using like a relatively modern term in my historical thesis. And I received some suggestions saying that maybe I shouldn't use such terms in my historical thesis. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
So this is why I started by talking about Susan Stryker's concept of transgender practice, focusing on practices in their historical context and what they meant in those contexts, instead of assuming some kind of trans-historical identity, which has always been the same in all times and places. I think that it's an act of intellectual humility to refrain from assuming that somebody in 18th century China would have identified, say, a trans woman if they were alive in 2025? There's no way to know. I have no idea. No, it's very possible, but it just strikes me as presumptuous to impose that. And also, out of respect for what I see as a cardinal core value of transgender politics today, self-determination, out of respect for that, I try to refrain from assuming these things. To me, that the strength of Stryker's approach is that it avoids anachronism, or it minimizes the risk of anachronism. And you see this in the work of other historians who've been inspired, like Claire Sears, who's at San Francisco State. Claire Sears wrote a very interesting book about cross-dressing and anti-cross-dressing laws in San Francisco in the 19th century. And Sears basically sets aside the question of whether these people who were arrested for cross-dressing would identify as trans individuals. She doesn't get bogged down trying to guess, because there's no way to know. Instead, she focuses again on what people did. They cross-dressed in this contest, all the information that she can get from police records and newspapers and so on, and talks about the sort of milieu of cross-dressing, and then also the laws against it, and what was the motivation for criminalizing this, and how did this work in the courts. It was a really interesting story. And again, by focusing on what people did and what it meant in that historical context, she bypasses this whole kind of impossible question about how would they identify if they were alive. To me, that's a very helpful approach as an historian. Now, it's different if we're just thinking about how people identify today. I mean, those categories are very meaningful to people now. They're real. I would not contest that. It's just that I think as historians, we need to acknowledge there's a limit to what we can know for sure about the past based on the sources that survive. And so I hope that the way I use transgender, I hope that it avoids the sort of problem of anachronism. I really try to focus on what people did, what it meant at the time. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but you know, we have to use vocabulary to talk about the past, and there's always some risk of anachronism. You talk about the proletariat in early 19th century England. Well, I don't think anyone at that time used the term proletariat, right? But it's a concept of a definition. If you use it carefully, it may apply. Anyway. Can't hear.
Okay. Hi, Professor Sommer. Thank you. I would just like to add one more question about how widely you think these case studies can represent how transgender was viewed in Qing China, because what we've discussed today has been case studies that apparently warranted a lot of attention back then and also now. And I just wonder, are they worth studying because they're very rare cases, or did you pick them because they are representative of a larger societal concept or opinion about gender?
Focus on two cases. I have a few more in the book, but I can say I have very few cases of this non-binary being prosecuted. Very, very few. It's a handful. And some of them did get a lot of attention. So they were written up, for example, in Guanzhou, like Xin'an Huilai, that suggests that they were seen as unusual by the authorities. Now, does that mean that in real life, this sort of practice was extremely rare? I can't prove it one way or the other, but as I said a moment ago, my guess is that for every one that ended up being prosecuted, leaving a case record, there must have been a lot of people like this who never left any trace in the historical record. I argue this more thoroughly in the epilogue to my book, so if you're really interested in that book, it's very short. but so, you know, one thing that's clear is that the way these cases were understood by the authorities and prosecuted, the way the law was applied and the reason behind that was representative of a large thinking on the part of the authorities. And it ties into the stereotype of sanctioned, where we talk about feedback and conviction and so on. That I think is a larger. But again, I think part of the challenge here is, on the one hand, you have this demonization, which is most obvious in the sources. After all these sources are produced by the judicial system. And in none of these cases where I have confessions, can I be sure that anybody is really speaking freely, because they're all under duress of one degree or another. So you have to be very careful interpreting that evidence. But you also get a glimpse of this other side, what we call sacralization, which again, this is what I think, I'm not trying to prove it. I think that the sacralization story probably was much more important and pervasive in real life than this demonization thing, which is this obsession of authorities and informs the law. Can I prove that? I don't think so, but it's what I think. And if you read the book, you'll see I try to use the indirect evidence, qualitative evidence, to try to make that point. Whether it convinces readers, I don't know. I mean, have to see. But that's what I think about. Are these cases representative? Some ways, yeah, probably. But there are very few of them. I should say that up front. There are very, very few of these that survive.
Okay, thank you very much. And for the sake of time, so we have to conclude here. And let's thank again for Professor Sommer bringing us this wonderful talk and the fantastic book. Thank you everyone for attending today's event.
Thank you very much.